Under a street in Reykjavik, water is moving. It left a mountain 2 hours ago. It was 83 degrees when it started. It will arrive at 81. Nobody sees it. There is no boiler in the cupboard, no tank in the roof, no meter counting fuel. There is a tap, and behind the tap, there is a country. The island that water is crossing is coming apart. Iceland sits on a seam in the earth, the North American plate on one side, the Eurasian on the other. They are pulling away from each other at roughly 2 centimeters a year, and the gap between them fills with fire. 32 active volcanic systems, an eruption somewhere on the island every 4 or 5 years, averaged across the centuries anyone has been keeping records. There are no forests to speak of, no coal, no gas, no oil. The nearest coastline that could resupply the island quickly is 800 kilometers away, across the North Atlantic, in weather that closes ports for days at a time. By every measure that usually decides where people settle, this should be a hard place to hold on to. It is also one of the warmest and cheapest countries in the northern world to keep a house through winter. 9 buildings in 10 are heated directly from the ground. Nothing is burned to do it. In parts of the capital, the pavements are heated as well. The snow lands on the stone and vanishes, and nobody comes out with a shovel. Both of those things are true at once. The rift that should make this island uninhabitable is the only reason it is comfortable. And there is a second thing, which is stranger. The volcanoes do not make the electricity. Roughly 7 parts in 10 of Iceland's power comes from meltwater. Rivers falling off glaciers, down through turbines buried in the interior, in valleys where nobody lives. The geothermal fields make what is left. And of all that electricity, about 4/5 never reaches a house at all. It goes to 3 factories that turn white powder into metal. Icelandic homes take somewhere around 4.5% of it. So the country the world calls volcanic is powered by ice. The country the world calls green runs a grid built mostly for aluminium. And the volcanoes, the thing in the title, the thing on the postcard, the thing everyone comes here to look at, deliver something else entirely. So what does this country actually run on? The answer is not one thing. It is 2, and they have to meet. What comes out of the ground at Hellisheiði is not electricity. It is not even water you would want inside your house. 2 kilometers down, sometimes 3, the rock sits between 200 and 300 degrees. Drill into it, and what climbs the well is a mixture, steam and brine together, under pressure, carrying dissolved silica and gas that it picked up on the way through the rock. Left to itself, that water would scale a pipe shut. It would eat a radiator in a season. So the plant does 2 separate jobs with it, and the difference between them is the whole story. The high-pressure steam is stripped off first and sent to the turbines. 6 of them at Hellisheiði, spinning generators. That is the electricity, and it is the smaller half of what the field is worth. What is left afterwards is heat. Hot brine, still carrying most of its energy, and nowhere useful to put it. So the plant sets it beside something else. Cold, clean groundwater, pumped up from the lava field next door. The 2 flows run down either side of a steel wall. Brine on one face, fresh water on the other. They never touch. Only the heat crosses. The brine goes back down a re-injection well, into the rock it came from. The fresh water leaves the building at around 83 degrees, clean enough to drink, soft enough to run through a radiator for 30 years without leaving a mark. That is the product, not power, water. Down here, the volcano is not a generator, it is a furnace. And every decision this country has made about how to live on a rift begins with that distinction. Fire heats this place, ice powers it. The entire machine is the argument between those two sentences. "30 kilometers east of the capital, the road climbs onto a plateau of black rock and grey moss, and the steam starts before the buildings do. Hengil is not really a mountain. It is a volcanic system, a swelling in the crust about 110 square kilometers across, sitting exactly where 3 rift zones meet. It has not erupted in something like 2,000 years. It does not need to. The heat is already up there, locked into rock that never got the chance to cool. 2 power stations stand on it. Nesjavellir on the northern flank, running since 1990. Hellisheiði on the southern side, since 2006. 300 megawatts of electricity, 200 of heat. The largest geothermal station in the country, and among the largest anywhere on Earth. Between them, they keep a capital warm. But the plants are not the difficult part. The distance is. Nesjavellir is 27 kilometers from the storage tanks above Reykjavik. Hellisheiði is about 20. Neither of them is in the city, and neither of them can be. You build a geothermal station where the heat is, and the heat is in the mountains, which means the warmth has to be carried down, in the open, across a lava desert, through a climate that spends half the year below freezing. You can stand next to the pipe. Most of it is above ground, around 23 of Nesjavellir's 27 kilometers. A steel line 90 centimeters across, wrapped in rock wool, sheathed in aluminium, resting on concrete piers that lift it clear of the ground. In winter, when it snows, the snow settles on the top of the pipe and stays there. That is the design in one image. A line carrying 83-degree water across a frozen plateau, and it does not melt the snow lying on its own skin. 2 things make that possible: the insulation and the speed. The pipe was built to carry up to 1,800 litres every second. At full flow, a litre of water crosses the whole 27 kilometres in about 2 hours. It simply does not have time to get cold. Slow the flow down and the loss climbs. Run it hard and it barely loses 2 degrees over the length of the line. The other thing that makes it work is that nothing pumps it. The water leaves a surge tank high on the mountain, 400 meters above the sea. From there, it runs downhill the entire way, under gravity, arriving at a valve station on the eastern edge of the city with as much as 27 bar of pressure behind it, which then has to be throttled back down to 2 before it can be let into a residential main. The line grows too. Fill 27 kilometers of steel with hot water, and it stretches more than 25 meters. So the pipe is not laid straight. It is built with deliberate bends, expansion loops set into the run, so that when the metal lengthens, it has somewhere to go. All of which delivers hot water to the edge of Reykjavik at almost the temperature it left. Arriving is not the same as being ready. There is a problem underneath all of this that has nothing to do with pipes. A geothermal field cannot be switched off. The wells run. That is what wells do. You can throttle them a little, but a high-temperature borehole is not a boiler with a dial. It produces at a more or less steady rate, hour after hour, through the night, whether anybody wants the water or not. A city does not behave that way at all. At 3 in the morning, a capital of 250,000 people is barely drawing anything. At 7:30, every shower in every flat opens within about 40 minutes of every other one. Demand can multiply several times over inside an hour, then collapse again by mid-morning. A constant source, a wildly variable demand. Somewhere between the two, something has to absorb the difference. It sits on a hill in the middle of the city, and most people who photograph it think it is a museum. Öskjuhlíð is a low wooded rise about 61 meters above the sea. The first hot water tank went up there in 1939, and the height was not chosen for the view. 61 meters of head is enough pressure to push water to the 10th floor of a building anywhere in Reykjavik, without a single pump in the system. 5 more tanks joined it over the following 2 decades. They were torn down and rebuilt in the 80s, and a glass dome was set on top of them. Each tank holds around 4 million litres. That is the buffer. That is the entire margin between a source that never stops and a city that wakes up all at once. The wells fill the tanks through the quiet hours. The city empties them at breakfast. The tanks refill through the day. It is one of the oldest ideas in engineering, a reservoir between a steady supply and an unsteady demand. And here it is, holding up the comfort of 2/3 of a nation. 4 of the 6 tanks are still in service. The other 2 were found to be surplus and turned into exhibition space. That detail matters more than it sounds, and it will come back. Because a buffer is not a source. A tank does not make heat. It only holds what has already been made, and it holds it for a defined number of hours. For as long as the water keeps arriving, nobody in the city ever finds out what that number is. Beneath the streets, the network fans out from those tanks through something on the order of 3,500 kilometres of insulated pipe. It reaches 95% of the buildings in the capital area. Schools, hospitals, blocks of flats, warehouses, the airport road. And when it has finished heating the buildings, it is still not finished. Water leaving a radiator is cooler than water entering one, but it is not cold. In Reykjavik, that spent water is sent on again, into pipe grids buried under pavements, car parks, and the ramps of the busier streets, where it gives up the last of its warmth to the stone above it. Snow falls on those pavements and does not settle. There is no gritting lorry. There is no salt. There is water that has already done one job, doing a second on its way out. None of this was planned by a government. In 1908, on a farm called Suðurreykir in Mosfellsveit, about 20 kilometers from Reykjavik, a farmer named Stephen B. Johnson ran a pipe from a hot spring to his house. That is the whole innovation. A spring a few hundred meters away, a length of pipe, and a farmhouse that stopped burning imported coal. It was noticed. Other farmers with steam on their land copied him, and by the 1930s, perhaps a dozen farmhouses in the south were heated this way. Small, scattered, unremarkable. Then, in November 1930, a 3-kilometer pipe was laid from the hot washing pools at Þvottalauga, where women had been carrying laundry out of the town for centuries, to a school in Reykjavik. Austurbæjarskóli became the first public building in the country to be heated from the ground. The demand it created was immediately larger than the supply. That is the pattern the whole century follows. Every time this country reaches deeper into the rock, it finds that it has already promised the heat away. There is one more thing the water does, and it may be the part that explains why people stay. There are more than 120 public swimming pools in Iceland, in a country of fewer than 400,000 people. Almost every town has one. Most are outdoors, and most are open in January. They are not leisure centres in the way the phrase is usually meant. Entry costs a few pounds. There is no dress code and no membership. In a village of 300 people, the pool is where the village happens, the place where arguments are settled, where children learn to swim before they learn to cycle, where a fisherman and a schoolteacher end up in the same hot pot at 7 in the morning because there is nowhere else to be. Around 4 in 5 adults in the country use them regularly. The habit is old enough that a stone pool at Reykjavik, fed by its own spring, was already worth writing about in the year 1178. A visitor sees a novelty. What is actually happening is that a nation has taken the byproduct of a heating system and built its social life inside it. The water heats the house, then it clears the pavement, then it fills the pool. Nothing here is used once. 90 kilometers inland, in a valley where the ground steams in the fields, there is a building full of tomatoes. Outside, it is January. The light lasts about 4 hours. The temperature has not been above freezing for a fortnight, and the wind is coming off an ice cap. Inside, it is the middle of a Mediterranean afternoon. Friðheimur sits on the geothermal belt in the south of the island, and its heat comes from a borehole 200 meters from the glass. The water arrives at around 95 degrees and runs through pipes laid along the floor of the house, under the rows. The plants are grown in pumice and mineral, volcanic rock, screened and sterilized, standing in for soil that Iceland does not have much of. The vines reach 9 meters. They put on a foot a week. The farm takes more than a ton of tomatoes a day out of a country that is treeless and subarctic and 800 kilometers from the nearest agricultural region. Iceland grows most of the tomatoes it eats, nearly all of the cucumbers, peppers, lettuce, herbs, strawberries, and it grows none of it on volcanic heat alone. 4 hours of daylight is not enough to ripen anything, so above the vines there are lamps, and the lamps do not run on the ground, they run on the grid, which means they run on meltwater off a glacier 300 kilometers away. A tomato grown at 64 degrees north is heated by fire and lit by ice. Take either one away and there is no tomato. There is a third thing in the house, and it is alive. Tomato flowers do not pollinate themselves efficiently. They need to be shaken at the right frequency, and the insect that does it best is a bumblebee, which grips the flower and vibrates its flight muscles until the pollen falls. Iceland does not have a bumblebee industry, so the colonies are flown in boxes, from mainland Europe. A few hundred workers to a hive. They live inside the glass, work the rows, and are replaced when the colony is spent. They cannot survive outside the building. Step out of that door in January and a bee has minutes. Every one of them is a passenger in a climate that is being manufactured around it by 2 power systems and a length of pipe. It is a small thing, a crate of insects on a cargo flight, but it is the shape of the whole country in miniature, a living component, imported, entirely dependent, doing a job that nothing native can do. And when the greenhouses need more than heat and light, the plants get carbon dioxide as well, drawn off as a byproduct from the geothermal plants, piped in and fed to the leaves. The vines grow faster, the yield goes up. The gas that would have gone into the sky goes into a tomato instead. Nothing here is used once. To find the other half of the machine, you have to leave the coast entirely. East Iceland, on the Highland Plateau, less than 200 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. There is nothing here. No farms, no road worth the name, no settlement in any direction for hours. There is a glacier, Vatnajökull, the largest ice cap in Europe, more than 7,000 square kilometers of it, and off its northern edge runs a river the color of wet cement, thick with the rock flour that a glacier makes as it grinds. Across that river stands a wall of stone 193 meters high and 730 meters long, holding back 8.5 million cubic meters of fill. Karanjúkur is the largest dam of its kind in Europe. Behind it is a lake that did not exist before it was built. Hálslón, 25 kilometers long, 57 square kilometers of drowned highland, 2.1 cubic kilometers of stored water. The water does not fall from the dam, it is taken out sideways. A tunnel almost 40 kilometers long, 7 meters across, drives east through the mountain to a power station buried inside the rock at Fljótsdalur. 3 tunnel boring machines were needed to cut it. The drop is enormous, the flow is constant, and the station produces 690 megawatts, which is a strange number for a country of fewer than 400,000 people. It was never meant for them. The entire project, the dams, the tunnel, the underground station, was built to feed a single customer 75 kilometers to the east. An aluminium smelter on the fjord at Reyðarfjörður, which had not been built yet either. The dam and the factory were negotiated together. Neither made sense without the other. But the part of Karanjúkur that matters most to the country is not the megawatts. It is the lake. Iceland has no interconnector. Not one cable leaves the island. There is no neighbor to buy from at 4 in the afternoon in February and nothing to sell to at 2 in the morning in June. Everything the country consumes has to be generated inside its own coastline, in the same instant it is used. Which means Iceland has no battery except water. Hálslón fills in summer. The ice cap melts, the grey river runs hard, and the level climbs through July and August until the lake is full. Then, through the winter, it is drawn down. The level falls as far as 75 meters from top to bottom over the course of a year. That fall is the country's entire stored reserve. Not just here, but at Thorisvatn, at Blundellón, at every reservoir in the interior. The nation's energy security is a set of lakes, and their level is decided by how much snow fell on a glacier the previous winter. Some years, it does not fall. When the reserves come through spring too low, the national power company has to take electricity away from somebody. Not from households, that has never happened, and the priority contracts are written so that it cannot. The cuts land on the customers who signed for interruptible power in exchange for a lower price. The fishmeal plants go first. They are told to burn oil instead, which they do, which means the greenest grid in the world responds to a dry year by putting diesel into the east of the country. Then the smelters are curtailed, 10% off the delivery. Then longer than expected, because the water does not come back on schedule. And everyone waits for the same thing: warm weather, rain. The snow in the highlands starting to move. A country with no fuel of its own, a grid that reaches everybody, and the most reliable renewable electricity on Earth. Sitting in an office in Reykjavik in April, watching a gauge, waiting for a glacier to make up its mind. Karanjúkur also cost something that cannot be recovered. 57 square kilometers of highland went under the water. Not farmland, wilderness, one of the largest unroaded areas left in Europe, wintering ground for reindeer, nesting ground for pink-footed geese, and a landscape that had never had a permanent structure on it. It was drowned to supply one factory owned from abroad. The opposition was the largest environmental movement in the country's modern history, and it lost. The project went ahead, and the consequences were not only the ones under the water. A reservoir fed by a glacier fills with silt. 10 million tons of it a year settle out of that grey river onto the bed of Hálslón. When the level drops through the winter, as much as 3/4 of that bed is exposed. A lake bed of fine glacial dust, drying in the wind, in the season when the storms are worst. The wind lifts it. It falls on the vegetation downwind, over an area estimated in the hundreds of square kilometers, in a country where topsoil takes centuries to form and can be lost in an afternoon. The power company's own later assessment of the project identified significant gaps against international best practice in how it was assessed and approved. That is the sentence, and it does not need decorating. The lake is still there. The metal is still shipped. The country still needs the winter reserve that the lake provides, which is the hardest part of it. There is no version of this where everyone was right. There are 3 buildings in Iceland that between them consume more electricity than every home, shop, school, hospital, hotel, farm, and office in the country combined, several times over. They are long, low, windowless sheds. One at Straumsvík, just south of the capital, running since 1969. One at Grundartangi, up the coast in Hvalfjörður. One at Reyðarfjörður in the East Fjords, the one the dam was built for. All 3 make the same thing in the same way, and the way has not changed in more than a century. Aluminium does not exist as a metal in the ground. It exists as alumina, a white powder, aluminium bonded to oxygen, and the bond is a strong one. The only practical method anyone has found for breaking it is to dissolve the powder in molten salt at around 950 degrees, and then push an enormous electrical current through the bath until the oxygen is stripped away and the metal falls out of solution. It takes somewhere between 13 and 15 megawatt-hours of electricity to make 1 ton of aluminium. An average European household uses a few megawatt-hours in a year. So a smelter is not really a factory that happens to use power. It is a device for converting electricity into a solid object you can put on a ship. The alumina arrives by sea, the metal leaves by sea. What is added in Iceland is current, which is exactly why they are here. And here is the part that changes how the whole grid has to be run. A smelter cannot be switched off. Inside those sheds are rows of reduction cells, hundreds of them, wired in series, each holding a bath of molten salt and metal, kept liquid by the current running through it. Cut the power, and the bath begins to freeze. Not in days, in hours. A frozen pot is not a pot you restart. It is a block of solid salt and metal that has to be dug out, and the cell rebuilt, and the line beside it will have cooled while you do it. A prolonged outage does not interrupt production, it destroys the equipment. So the load never varies. It sits there, hundreds of megawatts of it, 24 hours a day, every day of the year, at a near constant draw. For a grid operator, that is a peculiar kind of customer. It is beautifully predictable and utterly unforgiving. It also means something about the shape of the country's power system that is easy to miss. Iceland generates more electricity per person than any other nation on Earth, by a distance. And the reason is not that Icelanders use a great deal of it. It is that a population the size of a mid-sized town has built and maintains and staffs a national generating system scaled for heavy industry, with the households living quietly inside it, taking their 4.5%. The cleanest large grid in the world exists, in the main, to make metal for export. Both halves of that sentence are true. Neither one cancels the other. To see how any of it actually reaches anywhere, you have to look at the wire. Iceland's transmission system is a ring. One ring running around the perimeter of the island, hung on lattice towers and wooden poles across some of the emptiest terrain in Europe. Around 3,000 kilometres of overhead line, 75 substations, a few hundred kilometres of buried cable in the places where overhead would not survive. Most of that ring runs at 132,000 volts. In power system terms, for the distances involved and the loads being moved, that is thin. And there is nowhere for it to lean. Every synchronized grid in continental Europe is tied to its neighbors. When a plant trips in one country, the frequency dip is absorbed across a continent and nobody notices. Iceland has no such tie. The island's grid is its own universe, one frequency, 50 Hz, held up by generators inside a single coastline. Which means that on this island, at every second of every day, the amount of electricity being generated has to equal the amount being consumed. Exactly. There is no margin to import and nowhere to dump a surplus. The people who do that arithmetic sit in a control room, and their entire job is a number that must not move. Frequency is the pulse of a grid. Generate slightly more than the country is using, and the turbines speed up, and the number rises. Use slightly more than is generated, and everything slows down, and it falls. Let it drift far enough in either direction, and protection systems begin disconnecting equipment to save it, which removes load, which moves the frequency further, which disconnects more. That is what a cascade is. It takes seconds. So the operators hold reserve, generating capacity that is spinning, synchronized, and deliberately not being used, kept back for the moment something large disappears without warning. And on a grid where a single industrial customer can represent a substantial share of total demand, the thing that disappears without warning is usually very large indeed. There is a second problem in the geometry. 2/3 of the population, and most of the generation, sit in the southwest, around the capital. The largest hydro station in the country sits in the east, at the other end of the ring. Between them, the line is long and the coupling is weak, and power sent along a weak link over a long distance does not travel calmly. It swings. It oscillates back and forth between the two ends like water in a bath. And if the swing grows, the operators must split the ring deliberately before it splits itself. When that happens, the country stops being one grid. It becomes several. Electrical islands, each generating for itself, each with whatever plant happens to be inside its boundary, holding its own frequency until the ring can be closed again. A ring is the most elegant way to wire a country. It is also a shape with a specific weakness. A ring only has redundancy while it is a ring. Break it in one place and it becomes a very long dead end. In December 2019, a storm came into the north of the island, carrying freezing rain. The rain landed on the conductors and froze there. Ice built on the wire until each span was carrying many times its own weight, and then the wind took hold of the loaded lines and began to swing them. More than 100 towers and poles were damaged. Around 40 of them came down. 2 substations were hit, one by ice, one by salt driven inland off the sea. Akureyri is the largest town in the north of Iceland. When the storm was at its worst, the second city of the country was hanging on one remaining line. Further west, in Sauðárkrókur, some 2,500 people lost power altogether, and it did not come back that evening. The radio network used by the emergency services in the northwest went down at the same time, for the same reason. For a day, the north of Iceland found out what it is to be at the end of the wire. There were no imports to call on. There was no second corridor. There was a repair crew in a storm on a mountain road with a tower to rebuild. The cost was put at around $40 million. But the number that mattered was not financial. It was the discovery of how much of the country's normality was resting on a single overhead line built decades earlier for a smaller nation. And the north of the island is not unusual in that. It is simply the place where it showed. Everything discussed so far, the heat, the power, the metal, the wire, is made in Iceland. Everything else is not. There are no railways in this country, not one line anywhere. There have been 3 short industrial tracks in the whole of Icelandic history, the longest of them a narrow-gauge line used to build the Reykjavik breakwaters between 1913 and 1928, and it was lifted when the harbour was finished. The reasons are simple enough. Too few people, spread too thin, across terrain that swallows money. Glacial rivers that change course, sand plains, lava fields, and a winter that closes routes for weeks. So the country moves on 2 things instead: a road and a key. Route 1 is a single loop, 1,322 kilometres long, running all the way around the island. It was closed into a circle only in 1974, when a bridge was finally thrown across the glacial river at Skeiðará in the southeast. Until then, to drive between 2 towns on the southern coast, you went the other way round the country. Almost every settlement in Iceland is on it, or on a spur off it. Almost every ton of freight that moves inland moves along it, on a lorry. And at the western end of that loop, there is a wharf. Sundahöfn, on the eastern edge of Reykjavik, is the country's main cargo port. 900 metres of quay, 4 berths. Cranes that lift up to 140 tons, cold storage, chilled storage, and a customs hall. 2 shipping companies run the lines that matter, both of them Icelandic, both of them running fixed weekly rotations to Northern Europe and across to North America. What arrives there is almost everything. Grain, because it will not ripen here. Most fruit, timber, cement, steel, cars, machinery, medicine. Livestock feed for the sheep and the horses. The stone wool that insulates the hot water pipes. The pumice screens, and the seed and the crates of bees for the greenhouses. The alumina for the smelters, and the carbon anodes they burn through to make the metal. A container ship crossing from Rotterdam takes several days. In bad weather, longer. The country holds what is in its warehouses and what is on the water. 60 kilometres down the peninsula from that wharf, on a lava plain by the sea, there is a runway, and beside the runway, there are tanks. Keflavik is not simply the main airport. For practical purposes, it is the airport. Very nearly every passenger and every kilo of air freight entering or leaving the country passes across it. And this is the point at which the story the world tells about Iceland needs an honest correction. It is described constantly as the country that runs on renewable energy. Nearly all of its electricity is renewable. Nearly all of its heating is renewable. Both statements are accurate, and neither is the whole account. Around 1/5 of the energy this country actually consumes is oil, and every drop of it is imported. It arrives by tanker into the same handful of harbours. It goes into the cars and the lorries on Route 1. It goes into the aircraft on the runway at Keflavik. And it goes, in the largest single share of the maritime total, into the fishing fleet. The trawlers that catch the cod and the capelin that remain, alongside the metal and the visitors, one of the pillars this economy is standing on. The country with the cleanest electricity on Earth has some of the highest emissions per person in Europe. Not because of hypocrisy, because of arithmetic. Take 400,000 people, put them on an island in the North Atlantic with no rail, a fleet that has to go out in that sea, and an economy that depends on visitors flying in from other continents. And no amount of geothermal heat under the streets will change what a diesel engine needs. It is the one part of the machine that Iceland has not been able to build out of its own ground. And the ships that bring the fuel in are the same ships that bring the grain. There is one place in this country where people have already found out what happens when the ground takes the machine back. Heimaey is a small island off the southern coast, 5,000 people and one of the most valuable fishing harbours in the North Atlantic. A natural inlet sheltered by a cliff, deep enough for the fleet and calm enough to work in a gale. It is 1:30 in the morning on the 23rd of January, 1973, and a fissure opens in a field on the eastern edge of the town. It is not a distant mountain. It is 400 meters from the last row of houses. Along 1.5 kilometers of ground, 40 fountains of lava come up at once. The sea had been rough for days, so nearly the whole fishing fleet is tied up in the harbour instead of out on the water. By dawn, almost every person on the island has been taken off it by boat. The eruption does not stop. Ash falls for weeks and collapses roofs under its own weight. Lava buries 1/3 of the houses, and then it turns toward the harbour. If the flow reaches the entrance, the inlet closes. If the inlet closes, there is no fishing port, and without the port, there is no reason for anyone to come back. Not to that island, and not to a town that supplied a meaningful share of the national catch. A physicist named Thorbjørn Sigurgeirsson has an idea that almost nobody believes will work. Ten years earlier, during the eruption that built the island of Surtsey a few kilometers away, he had sprayed seawater onto an advancing lava front to protect a research hut. He had watched the surface stiffen. He had measured it. Lava is a poor conductor of heat. It carries its energy in the middle and gives it up slowly at the edges. But throw enough cold water at the front of a flow, and the leading face solidifies into a wall, and the still molten rock behind it has to go around or over or stop. On the 6th of February, firemen begin spraying the flow with 100 litres of seawater a second, using pumps flown in from the fire station at Keflavik. The lava front changes colour. Red and blocky becomes grey and jagged. So they scale it up enormously. A dredger is brought into the harbour to pump directly onto the flow. Kilometres of pipe are dragged across the crust of cooling lava by crews working in heat that sets the wooden supports alight and melts the aluminium ones. And the pipes survive, because the cold seawater running through them keeps them from melting. Over 5 months, something on the order of 8 million cubic meters of the North Atlantic is pumped onto a volcano. The harbour holds. The entrance narrows, and the new rock actually shelters it better than the old shore did. But that is not the part of this story that belongs to the machine. When the eruption ends, the town has a 2 square kilometre field of new lava sitting against it, and the inside of that field is several hundred degrees. And it will stay that way for years, because rock is such a poor conductor that it cannot get rid of its own heat. Sigurgeirsson writes a report proposing that the town use it. In early 1974, a simple heat exchanger is laid onto the surface of the new lava and cold water is pumped through it. The water comes out hot immediately. It is piped into a house nearby, and the house is warm. By the end of that year, an experimental plant is running. A closed loop, 9 boreholes sunk into the flow, 6 exchanger units, feeding 25 houses and the hospital. Then more of the town. Then most of it. The rock that had buried 1/3 of Vestmannaeyja spent the next decade heating what was left of it. And then the lava cooled, as lava does, and the heat ran out, and the town moved on to an electrode boiler and a cable laid along the seabed from the mainland, which is its own kind of dependency, on a different scale, arriving at the same shape. Everything in this documentary now converges on one plant, one pipe, and one peninsula. The Reykjanes Peninsula is the place where the Mid-Atlantic Ridge comes ashore. The rift that runs the length of the ocean floor climbs out of the sea here, crosses 40 kilometers of black lava and low hills, and continues inland. It is the first thing most visitors ever see of Iceland, because the international airport is built on it. Roughly 30,000 people live along it, and there is a geological rhythm underneath it that is longer than any human record-keeping. The peninsula does not erupt continuously. It goes quiet for centuries, 800 years on the last cycle, and then the fires return in episodes that run for decades before it settles again. For the whole of the modern era, Reykjanes was in the quiet part of that cycle. Everything on it was built during the silence, including Svartsengi. It is the 6th of November 1976, and hot water reaches the first houses in Grindavik. The plant that sends it is doing something nobody has done before. Every geothermal station until this point had made either electricity or heat. Svartsengi is built to make both, from the same field in the same building. The world's first combined geothermal power and district heating station. And it has to solve a problem that Reykjavik never had. In the capital, the water in the pipes is largely the geothermal water itself, drawn from low-temperature fields, mild enough in chemistry to send into a radiator. On Reykjanes, that is impossible. The field here is fed by seawater working its way into the rock, and what comes up the boreholes is brine, hot, saline, and utterly hostile to plumbing. So Svartsengi does not send its own water anywhere. It takes fresh groundwater. It strips the dissolved oxygen out of it first by boiling, because oxygen in a hot pipe is what eats steel. Then it heats that de-aerated fresh water with high-pressure geothermal steam through exchangers and injects a small amount of steam directly into the flow, so that the sulfur in it scavenges whatever traces of oxygen are left. Only then is it pumped out to the towns. The brine that gave up its heat runs off into the lava field beside the plant, where it pools in a hollow, bright blue with suspended silica. The country's most visited attraction is a byproduct pond of a power station. A year after Grindavik, the pipeline reaches Njarðvík, then Reykjanesbær, Vogar, Garður, Sandgerði. 6 phases of construction over 3 decades until every settlement on the peninsula is warm from the same building. Every settlement from one building. More than 21,000 homes take their heat from Svartsengi, and there is no other plant that can supply them. There is no alternative field on the peninsula that has been developed. There is no interconnection with the capital's heating network 45 kilometres away, because the two systems were built separately, for different water, at different times. And the heat travels to the western towns down a single main. For decades, none of that mattered. A single main is not a risk if nothing threatens it. Svartsengi sat in the middle of a lava field that had been cold for 8 centuries, and the arrangement looked less like a vulnerability than like efficiency. Then the peninsula woke up. The ground began to rise and fall as magma moved beneath it. Fissures opened in the lava fields. The rhythm that geologists had described from the rock record, the long quiet, then the long episode, resumed, on the timescale it had always been going to resume on. And it resumed underneath a power station, a town, and one pipe. What happened next is the clearest answer this country has ever given to the question this film started with. Lava crossed the line of the main. The conduit was cut. And the moment it was cut, the towns to the west were running on nothing but what was already in their tanks. People were asked to turn their heating down, to make the stored water last. By that evening, it was gone. Schools closed. Shops sold out of electric radiators and gas heaters and fan heaters. 30,000 people in an Icelandic winter, in houses built with no chimneys, no boilers, and no alternative heat source of any kind, because for 50 years there had been no reason to install one. crews worked in the cold and rebuilt the connection. A new main, already under construction before any of this, was finished at speed. The water came back. And then the same crews went out and did the thing that tells you what this really is. They began building walls. Earth barriers, tens of meters high, thrown up around the power station and along the roads and the pipe route. Not to stop an eruption, which is not possible, but to steer whatever comes next away from the one node that everything else depends on. Meanwhile, the engineers turned the plant itself into an instrument. By reading the pressure in their own boreholes, the same wells that supply the towns, they found they could see the magma accumulating below and forecast, with useful warning, when the ground was about to open. The heating system became the alarm for the thing threatening the heating system. And that is the answer. What does an entire country run on volcanoes actually mean? It does not mean lava turning a turbine. It does not mean electricity out of a crater. The electricity, mostly, is meltwater, and most of it goes to metal. It means that 90% of the buildings on this island have no heat source of their own, no fuel store, no furnace, no fallback. They have a radiator connected to a pipe, and at the far end of that pipe is a hole in the ground. And the hole is hot because the island is tearing itself apart. That arrangement is the cheapest, cleanest, most reliable domestic heating on Earth, and it has one condition attached. It only works while the pipe is intact and the plant is standing. Reykjavik has 6 tanks on a hill and 2 power stations feeding them. Reykjanes had 1 plant and 1 main, and found out in a single afternoon exactly how many hours of winter its storage was worth. Nothing here works alone. That is not a sentiment. It is the operating specification. Take the glacier away, and the lamps go out in the greenhouses. Take the port away, and the smelters run out of powder, and the bees never arrive. Take one ring of overhead line away, and the north of the country becomes an island inside an island. Take one pipe away, and 30,000 people are cold by nightfall. The country did not choose this. It inherited a place with no fuel, and no forest, and no neighbors. And it built the only machine that place would allow, every part of it carrying a load that nothing else can carry. There is a photograph that anyone who has driven in from the airport will recognize, though most people take it for the scenery. The pipe from the mountains running above ground across the lava on its concrete piers. Grey steel in a grey landscape. Snow lying undisturbed along the top of it. It is not hidden. None of this is hidden. The tanks are the landmark on the skyline. The steam from Hellisheiði is visible from the ring road. The blue pond beside Svartsengi has a car park and a ticket office. A country that lives inside a machine has put the machine where everyone can see it, and then decorated the parts nobody needed anymore. The honest question at the end of this is not whether Iceland is remarkable. It plainly is. The question is what a system does when it has been optimized for 50 years against a world that has changed underneath it. Svartsengi was a single point of supply because a single point was sufficient. The transmission ring was thin because thin was affordable for the country that built it. The reservoirs were sized for the winters that used to come. The pipe was laid where the ground was quiet. Every one of those decisions was correct when it was made. Several of them are now being made again, under conditions that were not on the table the first time. Some of the answers are already in the ground. The barriers, the second main, the boreholes reading pressure to give warning. Wind is being built into a system that has never had it. Lines are being rebuilt, heavier than the ones that came down. But the fundamental arithmetic has not moved. There is no cable to anywhere. There is no fuel under this island. There is no second country to borrow a winter from. Whatever Iceland uses, Iceland has to have already stored in a lake, in a reservoir of hot rock, or in 6 tanks on a hill above a capital. And nobody knows how long the peninsula will keep moving. Not the geologists, not the operators, not the people who live on it. The last episode of this kind ran for roughly 3 centuries. It could be a year. It could be a lifetime. What is certain is that the ground under the Reykjanes towns is not finished, and the plant that heats them is still standing in the middle of it, still the only one. Somewhere under a street in Reykjavik tonight, the water is still moving. It left a mountain 2 hours ago at 83 degrees, and it will arrive at 81. And in the morning, 300,000 people will turn a tap without once wondering where it came from. That is not ignorance. That is what a system looks like when it is working. The only time anyone thinks about the pipe is the winter it isn't there.